Thank you. Please be seated. Council, please approach. Take the stand. Please be seated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. Dr. Samuels, you are still under oath. Do you understand?
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to be asking the juror questions you submitted in the order you submitted them. If you have any questions about this procedure, please refer back to your preliminary jury instructions. Are you only allowed to testify about a client's conversations with their consent?
Yes. And just to clarify for the jury, a consent form is signed by the client, and they are instructed and informed that they do not have the same degree of confidentiality that they would have if they were being treated as a patient, and that anything that is said in the interview could be used in a report which will be handed into the court.
In the fight or flight scenario, does the body choose either to fight or flee?
That depends largely on the circumstances. The impulse is, there's a tendency for the impulses to flee. But in the event that you can flee, or if there are opportunities to protect yourself in a more direct fashion, then that tendency may evolve. But the tendency is to flee for most circumstances.
Can both occur at the same time?
Yes, we see that type of behavior. We saw it in this particular case as well, where there was an attempt to flee and at the same time.
He's answering the question.
Overruled. You may continue.
Thank you. Where a person then flees to a point where they can no longer flee, and therefore another set of self-survival behaviors kicks in. And so, yes, they can occur not necessarily simultaneously, but in a successive fashion.
Can memories blocked in a fight or flight event return over time, or are they forever lost?
If the hippocampus is truly flooded and shut down by the presence of these various chemicals that are rushed into the brain through the amygdala, unlikely those memories can ever be restored because they were never there to begin with. Sometimes memories can be restored if there's something there that you might be able to work on. But here, they were not recorded. It's as if you had a digital recording, let's say, and there was something wrong with the memory. It wouldn't be there.
How can we be certain that your assessment of Ms. Arias is not based on the lies that she has admittedly made over the years?
The diagnosis of PTSD is a function of a evaluation based upon, in my case, 35 years of experience in working with individuals with PTSD. You look at the fact pattern, you look at the circumstances that occurred at the time of the trauma, you look to see from the diagnostic list which of these characteristics are presented by the client, and it is on that you make your diagnosis. And I can say that within all reasonable psychological probability, she does meet the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder.
Did you use hypnosis on Ms. Arias to attempt to recover her memory?
No, I did not.
To your knowledge, did anyone else use hypnosis on Ms. Arias to attempt to recover her memory?
Not to my knowledge.
During the fight or flight reaction, do you believe it is possible that these memories do in fact exist?
Well, I'm basing my assumption on what I know about the physiology of memory, and it is less likely that memories are formed during that state of excitement and arousal. So I would have to say there's a high probability that the memories do not exist. They never existed.
If someone with that experience could draw from photos, journals, videos, and other methods, could they not extract some old, lost, or forgotten memories?
What happens sometimes is that people begin to read about what happened to them, and they hear stories from people who were there at the time of the incident, whatever that is. They may see photographs of what happened. They may begin to incorporate that information and form pseudo-memories that aren't real memories. They may begin to learn about the incident, but not from first-hand memories. But the strange thing about human memory is that we can sometimes be, sometimes are called implanted memories. And if you say things enough to an individual, especially children, you can actually get them to believe something that you've implanted, as opposed to having it been a true memory experience for them. So it's possible, but unlikely, especially for adults.
Are there other psychologists or doctors in your field who have differing opinions on the items you testified about, or is there 100% consensus in your field?
In psychology, there's never 100% consensus except in the rarest of circumstances. We usually couch our diagnoses and our assumptions and our theories and our hypotheses in terms such as in all reasonable psychological probability. Unlike some areas of medicine where if there was an appendicitis attack, you can actually go in and see that damaged appendix, remove it, and you now know the person does not have an appendix any longer. Psychology is not that precise. So we need to couch things in terms of probabilities as opposed to absolutes.
I believe you said acute stress disorder can be diagnosed within 2 months of the stress event, and you also said you diagnosed Ms. Arias with this, yet you didn't have your first discussion with her until 2009, more than 6 months after the event. Please clarify.
I will. I was able to diagnose Ms. Arias with post-traumatic stress disorder, which, as I indicated earlier, within all reasonable psychological probability, she was suffering from at the time that I evaluated her. Now, it's important to note that the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder is not a get-out-of-jail-free diagnosis. It's simply a statement that describes her emotional state at the time that the evaluation occurred. But the fact is that post-traumatic stress disorder is frequently connected to someone having undergone an acute stress reaction. You go up to Flagstaff, Arizona, and you see the giant meteor crater. Well, it was not always known that that was a meteor crater. For hundreds of years, I'm sure the people that lived there, having no scientific background and experience, believed it to be a depression in the earth. As people began to investigate that, it became more apparent, as knowledge began to accrue, that a meteorite actually hit the surface of the earth, forming that crater. The crash of the meteorite in Arizona, maybe 100, 150,000 years ago, I believe, was the equivalent of the acute stress disorder. The crater that's in the ground is the equivalent of the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. Again, it's not an excuse, and it's not a get-out-of-jail-free card, but it's something that describes what had happened before and gives us the impetus to go back and explore and to look and see what happened during the time of the trauma. And from that, we can infer that the trauma was of significant nature, of significant enough nature, that it could very likely have led to amnesia, dissociative amnesia, from that experience.
On what dates did Ms. Arias take the tests?
The tests were given at the end of December of 2009 and at the beginning of January 2010.
Can you be sure Jodi is not lying to you about the events on June 4, 2008?
Not with 100% certainty. I can't say that. However, when you look at the repeated stories, several different times asked the same question, the story was not 100% the same, but the basic aspects of the story were sufficient, and it seemed to, at least with certain elements, be consistent with the description of the crime scene. So I would say there's a very strong probability that once she finally told the right story, the second story, that she was being truthful at that time.
Would the shutdown of the hippocampus be affected by the level of control an individual has over the traumatic event? For example, a soldier intentionally bursts into a room to kill an individual versus an individual jumps out at a soldier on routine patrol.
Yes, in fact, if someone is trained specifically for combat, the likelihood of them developing a stress reaction at the time of a battle is significantly reduced, but not totally. And all you have to do is to look at the press releases, follow the television and radio reports, and see the number of cases of post-traumatic stress disorder that occur with our trained military people. Earlier in the trial, I referred to a Time magazine article that was referring to a trained police veteran who was a trainer, actually, who himself was involved in a shooting incident or where he was threatened with a gun. And he had many of the characteristics of an acute stress disorder. So even with training, it doesn't guarantee that you won't react with acute stress, but it does reduce your probability.
Regarding the events of June 4, 2008, do you feel Jodi had suppressed memories, or are they missing entirely?
It depends. Now, I can't measure that because we don't have the tools. We don't have a psychological MRI, for example, to check to see what memories truly exist. But based upon what is known about acute stress disorder and what is known about the neurology of memory formation, I would say it's highly unlikely that she has true memories of what occurred during that period of time when she was in acute distress.
If you feel she had suppressed memories, did you try hypnosis? If not, why?
In the case of dissociative amnesia, the memories are not there to bring back. Now, as I indicated, I have been asked by police departments at various times to try to use hypnosis. I've used it a few times. it's generally not all that helpful. It's because in cases of dissociative amnesia, the memories aren't there. Yet, it has been successful a few times, especially for officers to try to remember more clearly the description of the particular perpetrator that was involved in the interaction that they were having. I would say the probability of success is relatively small, and I generally don't use it for those purposes anymore because it was simply not cost effective.
As a professional, what steps do you take to assure yourself that someone has truly lost their memory or suppressed their memory, as opposed to simply lying about an event?
You have to look at the surrounding information. I have no way of being 100% sure that what we're dealing with here is dissociative amnesia, and yet all the evidence strongly suggests that within all reasonable probability, this is what happened. The reason we say this is because over the years, a great deal of research has been conducted on people who have been in similar situations, and there are consistent reports of dissociative amnesia occurring. It's a true phenomenon. It's not something made up. In fact, 30% of people convicted of homicide report amnesia, and it depends upon the nature of the killing. So I'm pretty confident that we can be fairly certain that she does suffer from amnesia for that period of time of the acute stress.
Do you feel it is possible for an individual to fool professionals into believing they have suffered post-traumatic stress disorder or acute stress disorder?
Again, if you take someone, if they tell you the story one time, you really have nothing to compare that with. And that's why a thorough investigation, a thorough evaluation, is the proper way to conduct such an evaluation. You just don't stop there. You start looking at the surrounding information. You try to get collateral input. In this particular case, we had crime scene descriptions, we had crime scene photographs. I re-interviewed her several times to get the story in several different ways. And it is my feeling that once the story changed, she was essentially telling what actually happened. We were also able to confirm the presence of trauma-related symptoms through the testing. The testing is sensitive to the presence of trauma. Now again, is this a 100% accurate situation? Like taking someone's temperature and it's 102.7 and we pretty much know that that's the temperature? No, it isn't. These are probabilistic techniques, and much of it is based upon our experience and a review of the other people's work in the field. And I'm pretty confident that she does suffer from amnesia and post-traumatic stress disorder.
To your knowledge, was Jodi tested more than once on any given test?
Not to my knowledge.
When you meet with someone, are you able to definitely tell when someone is lying or telling the truth, or is it based on your perceptions?
Well, unless you have corroborating information, or an individual is able to show through, well, that's corroborating information, actually. No, you can't. You have to go back and explore as much information as you can. If I had a way of telling whether someone was lying, my job would be a lot easier.
You stated she never said a negative thing in her journal, yet she made statements like she wishes suicide was a way out, but there is no escape, and said of Travis that he makes her sick and happy, sad, and miserable. Are those considered positive statements, referring to Exhibit 510?
Those are relatively mild statements in terms of the degree of what was written, the 1,500 to 2,000 pages, and not as many pages, obviously, from the period of time that she knew Mr. Alexander. But there was nothing in there like, I want to kill him, or I wish he were dead, or I wish I could, rip his eyes out. Nothing like that at all. Those were probably the strongest negative statements in her writings. And in comparison to all the verbiage that was flowery and positive, it's extremely mild. and extremely minimal. So while those could be examples, if you compare it to all the other writings in her journals, there's really very little evidence that she is a violent person.
Are there other disorders in the DSM-4 book that would list the same or similar symptoms or experiences?
Well, there's a similarity between post-traumatic stress disorder and an acute stress disorder. And the difference being that the acute stress disorder is primarily diagnosed within a month or so of the actual incident. So you need to be able to interview the individual very shortly after the incident. Well, obviously that was not possible. But post-traumatic stress disorder is basically the shadow of the possibility of an acute stress disorder having occurred earlier. And that's the example I gave earlier about the meteor crater. That's what the shadow of a catastrophic event that occurred a long time ago. But through investigation, we can ultimately determine what happened.
Is there any science to explain why some people can recall events and others cannot when involved in a stressful moment?
We know that there are individual differences. Not everybody in the same situation will experience and react to the stress in the same way. Some people may just have a high tolerance for responding to that type of stress, and others don't. Sometimes it's hard to predict what type of person is more prone to that than others. So while it's hard to say, we know that it happens enough of the time to make it highly probable that she did suffer the experience of an acute, and was diagnosable at the time with acute stress disorder by implication, but not by having been there, because that was impossible.
How do you ask your questions when interviewing an individual? Do you ask leading questions such as, do you experience memory loss, or do you have nightmares?
There are times when you have to ask a directed question such as that, but most of the time I just allow the individual to speak. If after several meetings they are not getting to that particular target, then I might have to ask a leading question. But part of our training is to ask questions in such a way that they minimally influence the answer.
You previously said 3 to 8 out of 100,000 people experience transient global amnesia. Now you say 3 to 8%, which is significantly higher. Which is correct?
It's 3 to 8 per 100,000 per year, not percent, cases per year.
You said transient global amnesia can be caused by sexual intercourse, immersion in hot or cold water, and a number of other things. Is the list you presented all-inclusive, or could it also be caused by something such as the trauma associated with getting a bad haircut, for example?
I would say that's unlikely, because those traumas that cause this are typically physiologically connected situations. Sudden change of body temperature, the sudden convulsions associated with intercourse. The list is extensive and inclusive as far as the 119 articles that were reviewed in order to get that data. But there were probably some other types of situations that can bring about a transient global amnesia. But again, those conclusions are only limited to the 119 articles that were reviewed for that particular study.
Is Ms. Arias taking medication to treat this terrible PTSD disorder?
She has been taking, at various times, she was on a tranquilizer, was on an antidepressant. Sometimes medication is suggested for PTSD, depending upon the nature of the symptoms. For example, some people experience intense anxiety, so one form of medication might be prescribed. Some others might be experiencing depression, and a different type of medication would be prescribed. But I was not involved with her treatment, and that was left to the jail psychiatrist and therapist to provide her with that medication. The reason I know that she was on this medication is that she told me she was involved, and medical records reflected that.
Regarding the Time article referenced in your presentation, The second bullet point highlights an officer's decision-making process shutting down as an example. If the decision-making process shuts down, how did Jodi get so much done the day Travis was killed?
During the intense, usually relatively short period of time of the acute stress, the higher cognitive levels are no longer processing correctly. The cerebral cortex tends to shut down and gives itself over to the basic survival instincts that are mediated by the old brain, those central parts of the brain that was in the center of the diagram that I showed. So a person can still be making judgments and decisions, but they are not higher level decisions. In other words, one does not sit down and think, well, if I do this, then well, this will happen, and maybe I should do this instead, or let me start planning something. That doesn't happen during acute stress. It's just survival. If there's a weapon at hand, people can still see. They can grab that weapon. If they're aware that there's a weapon near them, they might be able to grab that weapon. But extravagant planning does not occur during acute stress because of the way that the physiology has changed within the brain.
Did you diagnose any conditions that were not covered in your testimony? If so, what are they?
I diagnosed her as well with an anxiety disorder on the Axis 1 clinical disorder. There was evidence of post-traumatic stress disorder and anxiety. They're typically seen together. And on an Axis 2 personality diagnosis, I diagnosed her with a personality disorder not otherwise specified. It's definitely a personality disorder, but it had various components in it, and there was not enough information for me to feel definitively comfortable diagnosing her with one personality disorder or another.
When you use the word appears in your explanations about patient condition, does that mean you are not 100% sure?
As I indicated earlier, psychology is the science of behavior, and we're seldom 100% sure of anything in psychology. So when we say appears, what we're really saying is that the preponderance of evidence suggests this presence, but not with 100% certainty. Because as I said, there are a few things in psychology that can reach that level of confidence. But nonetheless, the science functions because we talk in probabilistic terms. There are other sciences that work in the same way. But psychology is particularly prone due to the lack of our precision, our ability to precisely measure what's going on in the brain. Now, we are getting better at that. Neuroscience has advanced tremendously in the last 10 and 15 years. And people are now looking with various kinds of imaging techniques to see what areas of the brain actually function under certain conditions. We are beginning to narrow down. There have been studies where electrodes are implanted in certain parts of the brain to see what areas of the brain are functioning during certain types of stimuli. But we can't use that on a routine basis. It's still at the point of research. Perhaps someday we'll be able to be more precise and be able to say things with even greater certainty than we can now.
Are your opinions based on what a patient tells you about what happened to them?
Not solely. You must look, doing an evaluation, it's imperative that you review all available information, collateral interviews, review if it's a crime-related situation, crime scene reports, victim reports, in order to form a complete picture.
In an extreme shock event where the hippocampus blocks the forming of memories, can the brain still function to make a rational decision during that time?
Well, it makes decisions. They're not always rational. For example, in this particular case, a camera was found in the washing machine.
I'm going to object. Previous order of the court.
Approach, please. Stating the objection. When discussing intrusive thoughts, did you use the term actors? If so, what did you mean by actors?
Well, what I was referring to was, and I think this relates to the fact that the story changed. A stressful incident occurred. Initially, it was explained that the stressful incident involved two people coming into the house and threatening her life. That's one set of actors. In the second story, it was Mr. Alexander who was going after her and threatening her life. That was the second set of actors, so to speak. He was the second actor. That's what I was referring to, only the change in particular specifics about the situation. Nonetheless, both would have been traumatic experiences.
Regarding the tremors or shakes you witnessed with Jodi, how can you tell it is caused by PTSD or memories rather than fear for herself and her future, fear of being found guilty?
Well, Ms. Arias told me not only did she occasionally shake and indicated to me that time connected it to an incident with Mr. Alexander, but she had other physiological changes as well, including, as we began our discussions and she began telling the second story, she would report to me that her hands became sweaty while she was discussing certain elements. So this is actually a second physiological reaction to thoughts and memories of what had gone on during the attack, at least at the beginning of the attack and the end of the attack, or the end of the incident when she was leaving. And those are the intrusive thoughts that she had. Those tend to produce sweaty palms as well. Shaking was reported in response to thoughts about Mr. Alexander yelling at her, chasing her, so forth.
Did you see Jodi shaking before she ever mentioned it to you?
I did not notice it initially, and the reason for that is because when I interviewed Ms. Arias, I was behind a partition that was about this high, and her hands were down on the table or in her lap. I couldn't see her hands. And there is a screen, a wire mesh screen, a very thick, very strong screen, that truly obliterates your ability to see. So it was very hard for me to observe that. She did point it out at one point. When I inquired about any physiological reactions, she told me that she shakes. Now I asked her, can you show me where it is that you shake? And she demonstrated it, but I don't think that she was shaking at that moment because of something we were talking about. But it would be very difficult for me to see under those conditions of interview.
Are the actions a person performs while the hippocampus is overwhelmed by a severe trauma be autopilot, non-reasoned reactions or choices?
Yes, that's precisely what I'm indicating here. They're not rational, tends to be disorganized, tend to be frenzied, tend to be poorly planned.
Are actions while in this state generally reflective or consistent with one's core personality?
They might be modified to some degree, but again, you're on autopilot here in a case of acute stress. And like in the case of the police officer who had a great deal of control, he knew what he can do, he was still overtaken by the acute stress. Now, he was able to pull out of it. He was able to react in less random, less frenzied ways than someone who had never been in a similar experience. So to the degree that maybe individual differences make a difference how we react, that's probably true. But when the core of the brain takes over and you're in that fight and flight reaction, you're really almost functioning on the instinctual level. And there's not much control over that.
Can these actions be extreme opposites to that? For example, a mild pacifist person becomes a violent, brutal person. Can the mind choose when the hippocampus is overwhelmed?
The brain doesn't choose when the hippocampus is overwhelmed. That's a physiological reaction to signals from the amygdala, which reacts to situations that are creating a danger for that individual. It's completely it's what they call, it's the autonomic nervous system. It's automatic. It's like an emergency system in an elevator, the emergency brake system in an elevator. If the cable snaps, the elevator may start plummeting down, but automatically, disconnected from anything else and using centrifugal force and gravity, the brakes automatically engaged. There's no thought involved with that. The reason that happens that way is that it has to happen quickly. And in order for a fight or flight reaction to occur, it has to happen very, very quickly. And there's little control that we have over that type of reaction.
In the process of killing someone, isn't it possible, even probable, that adrenaline output would increase whether someone was in fight or flight mode or in the act of a premeditated killing?
There's a difference usually between the crime scene of a premeditated killing.
Judge, may we approach?
You may. All right, Dr. Samuels, I'm going to repeat the question. The question is a yes or no question. In the process of killing someone, isn't it possible, even probable, that adrenaline output would increase whether someone was in fight or flight mode or in the act of a premeditated killing?
There are two questions in there, and they have different answers, Your Honor.
All right.
Okay? Is it possible? Yes. Is it probable? No.
If not, why? Without referring to this case.
Okay. People are different. People's level of experience are different. If someone is more prepared for a situation, it's less likely that they would go into an acute stress condition. And there are individual differences that it's very difficult to apply to this particular question. But the key is, sometimes it's not impossible, but the likelihood is not very great.
You have compared Jodi's PTSD multiple times to that of police officers and soldiers. Do you think that is a fair comparison, since police officers and soldiers kill as part of their job and duty?
Again, PTSD is a label that is used to identify a list of symptoms. The list of symptoms can be varied from person to person, and the presence of a PTSD disorder in no way suggests that someone didn't do whatever it is that they were involved with. It's simply a way of diagnosing them with a psychiatric diagnosis. So the symptoms are similar. The conditions that cause those symptoms may be different, but both can be said to be suffering from PTSD. But I certainly am not characterizing what happened on that fateful day as being equivalent to a soldier or a police officer doing their work. They're very, very different, even though the diagnosis is the same. If a person is involved in a knife fight and they get a slash in their arm, they have a slash in their arm. If they're in an automobile accident and they have a slash in their arm, they may both be diagnosed in medical terms with a slash in the arm, using the medical terms. But the circumstances that led to those two injuries are very different, even though the injuries are similar.
Is there a diagnosis for selective amnesia?
No, there is not. It is not a DSM diagnosis.
Would you continue to evaluate a person who was not being honest with you?
That happens sometimes, but rarely. But at some point, you have to give up. At some point, it may be appropriate to say to that person, look, I don't feel that you're cooperating with me. Let me find you another evaluator with whom you may feel more comfortable, more open, and more honest. So there are times when you just have to give up. It's foolish to just continue. It's not productive.
Why didn't you re-administer the test once Jodi admitted to killing Travis?
I reviewed the test, and the reality is that her numerical score, which is what is used to determine whether or not a person meets that diagnosis, would not have changed, because the only change in the test is a description of what the most intense stressor was. And the descriptions are used for the purpose of psychotherapy, not for diagnosis. So the presence of the disorder is determined numerically. The particular type of trauma is used for purposes of therapy. So it really didn't need to be re-administered.
It seems 25 to 30 hours is very inadequate to evaluate someone who has killed another person, especially in such a traumatic way that Ms. Arias did, and to diagnose her with PTSD. Wouldn't you agree that this amount of time was inadequate to accurately evaluate and diagnose Ms. Arias?
No, not at all. Typical evaluation may run 6 or 7 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours if you do a lot of testing. If it goes beyond 20 or 30 hours, the nature of the relationship begins to change. You become a constant visitor. There may be a sense that you're a visiting friend. There may be a tendency to want to offer advice to the individual. So unless they were extremely extenuating circumstances, what I gave her in terms of this evaluation, by reviewing the material over and over again, then going back when some new material came in, is what I consider to be quite appropriate for this case.
Is the MMPI test utilized for any other uses other than therapy? For example, is it validated for specific job requirements?
Well, that's very controversial. Some companies do give personality tests when they hire people. That's a very controversial area because that's probing into the privacy of an individual. It provides medical and psychological information in an employment file. So the answer is that it's a very controversial area. It is being done. Sometimes it can actually be helpful and beneficial, but I believe it's a violation of the individual's rights to privacy.
Referring to Jodi's diagnosis for PTSD, when did you catch the errors on your report?
When I started to prepare for trial back somewhere in November or December, because this trial has been moving forward. And when I started to review in fine detail, I noticed that I had omitted a couple of letters and numbers. And so I created a separate page with the correct numbers and the various criteria, which I brought to court with me and used as part of my testimony.
Do you feel those were big errors?
Well, they weren't great errors, but it didn't change the outcome of the report. It would have been a little confusing for someone who was reading, and they would probably have pointed it out to me. But they were a couple of typos, and I admit I made them.
You said on redirect that Ms. Arias remembers the beginning of the attack and then the end of the attack. Therefore, she would have a memory of events after the attack ended, such as cleaning up the scene, deleting photos from the camera, putting the gun in the car, and so forth, correct?
No. She would remember details of the beginning of the trauma, but, and I don't know how much details you've heard in terms of her recollection in other testimony because of the rule of exclusion. I'm not aware of what others have testified to. But what she told me was that she snapped back into reality when she was near the Hoover Dam and discovered herself covered with blood. That's the end of the incident that I'm referring to, when the chemicals in the brain dropped down to a level where her hippocampus and her conscious awareness were able to kick back into normal. That's the end of the event, not the fact that the stabbings may have been over. She was still in an acute stress reaction at that time.
Can the acute stress occur if someone plans to kill versus defending themselves when in danger?
Could you repeat that, Your Honor?
Can the acute stress occur if someone plans to kill versus defending themselves when in danger?
Planned homicide is of a different nature.
Sustained. Can you answer yes or no?
I'm sorry?
Can you answer yes or no?
Could you repeat it one more time? Let me see if I can do
Yes.
it.
Can the acute stress occur if someone plans to kill versus defending themselves when in danger?
Possible, but not probable.
Do you often make mistakes in your reports when you do evaluations?
No.
Can you tell us where Jodi said she was when she was coming out of her fog after the killing?
She recalled going through a police or a border patrol checkpoint near the Hoover Dam. That's when she came to, so to speak, found she was covered with blood, and then she said that she suddenly realized something terrible had happened.
You seem to have several issues with omitting or forgetting to include information. Do you think that it is important to have an accurate and complete report for a trial like this?
Yes.
Why didn't you complete a new PDS after Jodi changed her killing story? If her answers were based on an intruder story, how can you say with certainty that she has PTSD if her answers are fictitious?
The items on the test that a person endorses are basically a list of traumatic experiences. They include things that happened in childhood. They include things that happened around the time of the actual major event, the most recent one. And in looking at her test results, it appears to me that there would be no change in the numerical scoring. The difference would be in the identification of the stressor. Now, it was obvious that a terrible event occurred at the Alexander home. And whether or not it was perpetrated by an outside person or self-perpetrated by her would not change the numerical scoring, but it certainly changes the focus of our attention. If anything, it would make her trauma worse if she was the one who was involved in the killing.
Do you consider yourself an impartial third party in this case?
I try to be at all times.
Do you always develop such a fond relationship with the individuals you evaluate?
I wouldn't characterize our relationship as being fond. I'm an impartial evaluator.
Do you still think that it was appropriate to purchase a gift for Jodi while evaluating her, or do you feel you stepped over an ethical boundary?
There is no ethical guideline regarding purchasing a self-help book for a client that you've just met for the first time. No further discussion of the book occurred. I just happen to be a compassionate person. I've done this with other clients that I've evaluated if I feel it would help them. But since I can't do therapy and I am a compassionate person and I have been doing therapy and evaluations for 35 years, I feel that that is not at all stepping over the boundary.
For the D2 criteria example, you mentioned a phone call between Jodi and her mom. Can you explain what happened on that call and how it fit into that criteria?
Yes. We're not talking about one call. Ms. Arias indicated to me that she frequently gets angry at her mother when she speaks to her. And of course I asked, did this happen once? Did it happen twice? She says, no, it happens with some regularity. So I took that as an indication of irritability.
Would anyone having an argument over the phone with a parent fit that criteria?
She described it as a venting of her anger towards her mother. And in fact, she indicated that that type of venting towards her mother was usually the most intense of any time that she would vent. Her mother became her target for her frustrations.
In your professional opinion, do you think that someone who is able to confront their boyfriends and the women that they are cheating with display assertive behavior?
She may have been somewhat assertive at that particular moment, but in general, she has been a very unassertive person. And that example of that is going along with things that she felt were not right for her, but she went along with it because she felt it would make Mr. Alexander happy. A truly assertive person will stand up for their rights, mark their boundaries, and in a rational manner get the point across that this is not right for them, and if you respect me, you won't do that anymore. She was completely unable to do that. That's a very strong indication of someone who is not assertive.
Do medications cause any of the various amnesias you described?
Well, yes, in fact, there's a category for medically induced amnesia in the DSM. The kind of diagnosis for Jodi, that of dissociative amnesia, which is frequently occurring in cases of post-traumatic stress disorder and acute stress disorder, is not the same thing. But in hospital settings, with geriatric patients frequently, amnesias can occur as a result of medication. But what's interesting is that once the medication is changed, or they come out of the effects of anesthesia, for example, memory is usually restored.
Since you did not meet with Jodi until December 2009, isn't it fair to say you are not 100% sure that Jodi suffered from acute stress?
That's correct. We'll have to look at her report. We have to look at the crime scene to infer that that actually occurred.
Under cross-examination, you admitted that Jodi having anal sex was relevant to your diagnosis, and then under redirect, you stated it was not relevant. How do you account for this inconsistency in your testimony?
The things we were talking about that are irrelevant was the fact that she had tried anal intercourse with 2 prior boyfriends on a couple of occasions. The part of this anal intercourse that was critical in this case was the frequency with which it occurred in her relationship and the connection of that to other concerns that were expressed to me about Mr. Alexander's sexual proclivities.
When a patient or client changes the story, misrepresents, or does not necessarily tell the truth to you, does it raise a red flag?
Well, it always raises a red flag, but in my opinion, and consistent with the diagnosis, it is possible that the first story was a form of depersonalization. In other words, a psychological reaction in an attempt not to have to deal with the horrors of what actually transpired on that day. In a sense, she created an alternative reality. Now, you could look at that as a lie, or you could look at that as a psychological defense mechanism and an ultimate example of denial, the creation of an artificial reality. At some point, I actually was considering the diagnosis of a dissociative identity disorder, which used to be called multiple personality, where a person had multiple personalities at different times, personalities that existed separately but not at the same time. I disregarded that initial hypothesis when I learned more about the case, but certainly that was one of my considerations. Her creation of the story, in my opinion, fits the psychological condition known as denial and known as depersonalization, and it satisfied the need to put an emotional distance between the horrors of that day and her previous belief system of being a peace-loving individual.
Sending a self-help book does not seem that it would ensure the success of an evaluation, but would help to ensure the success of therapy. Would you concur?
I recommend that book, by the way, it is an extremely well-known book. It can help people who are in therapy, and it can help people who have very low self-esteem and make them more comfortable dealing with the realities of their life. That was my main purpose, was to see if I could get her to read that book, perhaps, now I don't know, because I think she told me she read it or was reading it at one time, but I never inquired about it. The idea would be, if she could feel more confident about herself, maybe she could let go of this rationalization, of this denial, of this defense mechanism. Whether that was influential at all, I don't know. But ultimately what happened was that she finally admitted the second story.
You said on redirect that if someone is making up a story, their story tends to be consistent. Is that correct?
Frequently, a made-up story will be consistent from recitation to recitation, and presented with pretty much flat affect, because it is rehearsed, and basically they're pulling out that information not from their experience, but from the memorization of this idea, this script that they've developed in their mind. It's hard to deviate from a script if you're memorizing a script. So my feeling was that in the presentation, the television interview, and the early interviews I had, there was a certain degree of consistency, but yet almost a mechanical consistency, and presented with flat affect, which made me suspicious that the story wasn't actually true. Now, of course, I also was aware of the forensic evidence, which would have made this story impossible.
If so, then if Ms. Arias is making up a story currently, wouldn't it make sense that her story is consistent?
Could you repeat that? I'm not sure that the question is clear.
It's a follow-up to the question you just
okay.
answered. You said on redirect that if someone is making up a story, their story tends to be consistent. Is that correct? The second part is, if so, then if Ms. Arias is making up a story currently, wouldn't it make sense that her story is consistent?
Yes, if the second story is made up, there would be various consistencies within that story. When it was repeated to me a number of times, more details began to be added to the story. I developed a fuller picture of what actually had transpired. So that to me seemed like a more genuine recitation of what actually had transpired.
You stated that you reviewed interviews with Jodi's family and friends as part of her evaluation. Who conducted those interviews?
Those interviews were given to me in summary form by the defense team, and I don't recall who did it. In fact, I think it was an earlier defense team that had accumulated those interviews.
Are there validity scales on the PDS test? If so, were Jodi's validity scores out of the normal range?
There are no validity scales on the PDS.
Does your code of ethics or any other guideline explain what you are to do if you believe someone to be suicidal or a potential harm to themselves? If so, what are those guidelines?
Well, the guidelines are to inform the closest people to that individual. Obviously, Jodi was in jail at the time, jail authorities, and so on. But her discussion of suicide did not have any plan associated with it. And she said that she had been assuming that she would have committed suicide at some point along the way. It's one of the things that she said. I did not see any plan. By the time that I got to her, she was not suicidal. She claimed to have been feeling that way early on in the experience that she had, and I didn't get to see her until many months after she was incarcerated.
Can you review your notes regarding Jodi being tied up by her hands and feet and Travis climaxing as he cut the rope? Was this the day of the killing?
There was one incident on the day of the killing, yes.
Why do you believe Ms. Arias' self-esteem was very low early on in her relationship with Travis, since this is well before the time period that you evaluated her?
Well, from things that she told me and from her writings, but primarily from things that she told me. Her description of the nature of the relationships that she had with men, her description of herself, the fact that she viewed Mr. Alexander as, and these were her words, a better class of guy. She believed, almost considering him to be like a guru, someone who was going to help her rise above the level that she was currently living. And these are things and statements that someone who is looking for an answer, someone who feels they need a hand, will frequently say. She also tolerated abusive behavior, in my opinion, that many assertive women would not put up with, including sexual encounters that were uncomfortable, being disregarded in mixed social situations, being asked to leave the grandmother's house through a window so not to be caught, feeling publicly humiliated, and then going back to the situation with Mr. Alexander. It was a litany of these kinds of stories told to me that made it very easy for me to consider her as a person with low self-esteem.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to take the noon recess at this time. Please be back in the designated area at 1:25. Please remember the admonition. Have a nice lunch. You are excused. Please be seated. There's some additional questions. We are at recess. Council, can I see you before you leave for the noon recess? Please be seated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. Dr. Samuels, I'm going to continue to ask questions posed by the jury. In your years of experience, wouldn't you say low self-esteem is quite normal in the general population?
It's not normal, it's reasonably common, and it certainly should become a target of a therapeutic intervention, because self-esteem truly limits a person's ability to make a mark in this world. So I wouldn't call it normal. It's still an undesirable condition. It's not uncommon, but it's certainly not normal.
How did Jodi's test results go toward her diagnosis of PTSD if she was still telling the intruder story at the time of the test?
My diagnosis of PTSD was based upon the fact that she met the criteria as listed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for PTSD. The tests, in my opinion, confirmed my selection of that diagnostic category, but the diagnosis could have been made without the presence of those tests.
Within the norm population used for a given test, if a segment of those individuals were to lie, could that cause a loophole, for lack of a better term, in that test that could possibly allow a client taking that test to lie without detection?
If the validity scales on a test were created with a group of people who lie regularly, it would certainly skew the results. But again, the PDS test does not have a lie scale or a validity scale built into it. The MCMI does, but that is based upon thousands of individuals taking the test and comparing their results with what else is known about those individuals. So when a test has a validated lie scale or an inconsistency scale or an exaggeration scale built in, that's a pretty good determiner of not whether they lie in general, but whether or not they're lying on that particular test. The scales that portend to detect lying in general are not very effective.
Is there an assumption that those in the norm population are answering truthfully?
Can you please repeat that, because it's a general question?
Is there an assumption that those in the norm population are answering truthfully?
Yes.
Isn't it possible that a hypothesis formulated early on could skew results when tests are evaluated by the same individual that formed that hypothesis?
Well, if the individual was not a trained psychologist or psychiatrist or mental health worker, it's possible. But keep in mind that the MCMI test was scored by a computer, which is the reason why I prefer to use computerized scoring when it's easily and readily available, and especially if there's any complexity to the scoring. And that way, it serves as a second opinion to my decision-making process. The PDS can be scored by a computer program, but it's also available in a hand-scoring version. And because I don't use it as extensively as the MCMI or the MMPI, I chose to score it manually. But the test is constructed in a way that there are no decisions that I have to make in scoring that test. It's the client who writes down a number which corresponds to the degree and intensity of a particular trauma. I don't go ahead and change those numbers. I simply add them up, and the numerical value is what determines whether or not the diagnosis can be made. So there's very little room for error or bias in that type of a test.
Could that hypothesis affect or color how the evaluator reads or interprets tests, answers in interviews, interprets crime scenes, etc.?
The hypothesis that a evaluator makes is constantly changing based upon the availability of additional information. If a person's doing therapy, the hypothesis that is made is much more fluid because you are interacting with the individual and you're attempting to make some changes in the way they think or the way they behave. But in an evaluation, you may have an initial idea as to where it's going, but that should never guide your outcome. If anything, it may help you select the tests that you want to use for confirmation, but if you are a properly trained individual with the proper experience, it should not matter what your initial hypothesis was, as long as you don't take that hypothesis on and on and on and are unwilling to change it if the data shows that your hypothesis was incorrect. In other words, you don't get attached to your first ideas, your first guesses.
Based on the dissociative amnesia article, would you agree that 3 to 8 people out of 100,000 people studied is a very minute number?
That actually is referring to the transient global amnesia article that I was referring to. And I selected that article not because it's directly related to this case.
Question.
Sustained. Regarding the fight-flight response by Jodi on June 4, was there ever any discussion between you and Jodi regarding her response and why she did not flee from the bedroom?
Well, what she told me was that she did try to flee, and at some point she felt that she needed to protect herself. So I think that she did engage first in flight, and then only when threatened further in fight.
Is it your normal practice to fill out the answers on the questionnaire for those you are evaluating?
Sometimes I may do that for them, and sometimes not. Most of the time I have people do it themselves, but this particular case I filled it out.
Do you have any concerns with errors or incorrect responses?
No, my work was checked several times.
If a patient you saw consistently lied and kept to that story, then answered a test or series of questions based off of the story the client believed, how could that test reveal that they are lying, especially if that person remained consistent within the series of lies?
Well, if we were talking about the PDS test, that test result is not based upon the actual nature of the trauma, except for the case of the trauma being identified as a therapeutic goal. But a person who is evaluating their own level of stress for particular types of experiences they've had throughout a lifetime, you would find that it is somewhat irrelevant as to the exact nature of the stress, knowing that a stressor had occurred. In other words, their responses on the test are not so much to the actual stressor, or the details of the stressor, but whether or not they have faced situations in their life where they have been under stress. That's what you score and that's what you calculate.
You stated that Jodi answered number 13 on the PDS test the way that she did because of repeated physical and emotional abuse from Travis, and she explained this to you in your session after she took the test. When she took the PDS test, wasn't she still telling the intruder story and had not told her story about Travis's abuses yet?
Yes. No, she told me about his abuses early on, but not the actual incident of the killing.
Are questions number 16 through 21 on the PDS test based on the event listed in question number 14, in the time frame in question number 15, which would be the intruder story from 6 months to 3 years ago?
Yes, that's true.
If yes, this event never happened, so those answers, number 16 through 21, are based on a fictitious story. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Are these questions, number 16 through 21, part of the overall score to determine whether Jodi has PTSD or not?
Yes.
Do you feel comfortable with diagnosing a person with a condition if they continually lie to you, hypothetically speaking?
I would not make a diagnosis if I was aware that someone was telling me a lie. But her interview data, the crime scene data.
Objection beyond the scope of the question, generally speaking.
He's attempting to answer the question, so it's not left wondering what exactly he meant.
Overruled. You may continue.
Okay, could you please repeat the question?
Do you feel comfortable with diagnosing a person with a condition if they continually lie to you, hypothetically speaking?
Well, if I knew someone was lying and what they were telling me was unsubstantiated by anything else, and somehow I knew that they were lying, I would not make a diagnosis. That would be inappropriate.
Regarding question number 29 on the PDS test, not being able to remember an important part of the traumatic event, Jodi scored this a 1, indicating this doesn't bother her often. Considering that she killed Travis and claims significant memory loss during the event, doesn't it seem inconsistent this wouldn't bother her significantly?
If the memory has not been formed and it's not there, then thinking about it doesn't really occur. And therefore, she may have been reporting that she doesn't think about it, or the actual incident, because she simply doesn't remember it. So that would be consistent for someone with amnesia.
Given that the Time article mentioned that homicide suspects have reported memory loss, is it possible that a person can plan and carry out a murder and still suffer memory loss, acute stress disorder, or post-traumatic stress disorder?
Possible, but less probable.
Even if intentional, isn't it possible the event would still be considered stressful?
Is that referring to that same question?
Yes.
It's possible, but not probable.
If Jodi was in fight or flight mode when she ran out of the bathroom, why would she run into the closet and corner herself?
From my understanding, the closet had 2 entrances. It was a pass-through between 2 rooms. And so I don't think she viewed it as a place to hide so much, but as a place to walk through or run through in order to run away from Mr. Alexander.
Wouldn't someone in fight or flight mode want to get away from the danger?
Usually that's the first step, but if you can't get away from the danger, then the next thing to do is to fight.
Would they want to get help from someone?
Well, I think based upon the intensity of the trauma, if one's life is being threatened, I suppose that if there was somebody in the adjacent room to call, maybe that would have resulted in a shriek or a shout, but she seemed to have been there alone with Mr. Alexander, and this is all going on in milliseconds. She survived on a mechanical basis, an instinctual basis, and the way she handled it was the way that came out of her. Again, to make a phone call or to run out the house if you can get away, running for help takes longer. And while that's possible that someone may be able to do that, apparently under these circumstances, that was not an alternative.
Are you able to state that Ms. Arias had either PTSD and/or acute stress disorder before the incident on June 4, 2008?
I can't determine whether or not she experienced an acute stress disorder at another point in her life, and whether or not, if she may have been diagnosed with PTSD at that time, although from what I was learning from talking to her, many of these symptoms occurred after the incident had occurred, such as the emotional numbing, the physiological reactions that she was experiencing, etc. So while it is possible that she might have been diagnosable with PTSD, I didn't see the likelihood that that was the case.
Would someone who plans to kill another and does be less likely to suffer acute stress than someone who kills an individual accidentally?
Accidentally? Well, if we're referring to something like a hunting accident, again, you're not, if you accidentally shoot somebody in the woods, you have a very lower likelihood of falling into a flight or fight response. So the likelihood of developing an acute stress disorder is probably less for that type of circumstance than if you were planning to kill somebody. But on the other hand, if the killing occurs within the context of an argument or a fight, or is emotionally charged and comes up suddenly, there's a greater chance that someone will enter an acute stress reaction or develop an acute stress reaction.
Is it possible that Jodi didn't write negative things about Travis because there was nothing negative to write?
While possible, that would be inconsistent with what I learned later on about the nature of their relationship, and in seeing some of the text messages, in listening to some of the telephone calls between the two of them, or the telephone call between the two of them. There was an indication that it was a rather tumultuous relationship. And so, therefore, while she didn't write about these things in her journal, that was consistent with her style of glossing over difficult times with Travis that was supported by other information that was made available to me.
If one has suppressed feelings repeatedly, would it be a natural reaction once the dam breaks, for example, a gunshot that hits Travis, for all the repressed feelings to express themselves in carrying that violence to the extreme, overall of stab wounds?
Could you please repeat that again?
If one has suppressed feelings repeatedly, would it be a natural reaction once the dam breaks, for example, a gunshot that hits Travis, for all this repressed feelings to express themselves in carrying that violence to the extreme overall of stab wounds?
Yes, that is a characteristic of an emotionally charged killing.
If something is premeditated, is amnesia more or less likely to occur?
I would say less likely to occur.
You stated that Jodi did not have control of what her mind was doing during the killing. If that is true, how do you explain her dragging Travis's body and trying to clean up the crime scene?
The attempts to clean up the crime scene appear to be rather frenzied, disorganized, impulsive, and not well planned or thought out. These are characteristics seen when someone is in a state of acute stress. If you would predict that if someone had planned this terrible deed, that plans would have included cleaning up the crime scene in order to get away and reduce the risk of apprehension. But that was not the case in this particular incident.
In earlier testimony, you stated that once you found out the true story, you should have retested for PTSD, but didn't because it was an oversight. Just now, you said you didn't retest because you believed her score would remain the same, which is correct.
When I was being questioned on Monday, I must have been, I admit, I was a bit thrown by the veracity of Mr. Martinez's questioning.
Sustained.
So I was a little thrown. First of all, there is no set procedure that would require me to do a retest. In terms of my later analysis, after it was made clear that I had tested her prior to the story, I reviewed the material and made the determination that the score would have been essentially the same. There is no set requirement that I test to begin with, and there's no requirement that I need to retest either, nor is there a requirement that I test at all. The diagnosis was an initial hypothesis, and it was reinforced not only by the PDS, but also by the MCMI and all subsequent information that I learned about this case.
Was there anything in the book you gave Jodi that would alter her responses to test questions or your questions?
No.
How can you be sure that Jodi did things to please Travis when you didn't have a chance to speak to him?
Could you please repeat that?
How can you be sure that Jodi did things to please Travis when you didn't have a chance to speak to him?
Well, I reviewed text messages, emails, her writings. I listened to a tape that was made between the two of them, and it indicated to me that she had a very weak response to what many experts or individuals would view as abusive behavior.
How do you know that she didn't kill Travis out of jealousy?
How do I know that? Only from writings and a conversation that they had, for example, on the phone, where they were discussing the fact that they might be marrying other people. Her writings did not indicate a strong degree of vindictiveness. She, in fact, was planning to visit another man in Utah on the day of the crime because she was hopeful that a relationship might start with him. Not the typical thing that an overly jealous person would do. Is it possible that she was a little jealous? Of course, but I don't believe, based upon what I've read, that that was the predominant emotion.
Are acute stress and PTSD the only diagnoses that would present the criteria in the DSM-IV book, or do those criteria appear in other possible diagnoses?
Some of the criteria may appear in other diagnoses, but the only place the PTSD diagnosis constellation appears is in the section of the DSM that defines or describes PTSD. While the diagnostic criteria for an acute stress disorder are similar, they are not identical, but they do have a great deal of overlap. But by and large, if a person meets the criteria of PTSD, it's unlikely that any other set of criteria would be met in full. Now, one of the characteristics, for example, of PTSD is an elevated anxiety level. That could also diagnose the individual with an anxiety disorder, which is in essence what I did.
Ladies and gentlemen, do you have any other questions? It appears there is one additional question in the basket. Are there any others? Counsel, please approach. You just stated that Jodi's physiological symptoms did not appear until after the event on June 4, 2008. Did she ever talk about those type of symptoms occurring prior to June 4, 2008?
She did indicate to me in one of our conversations that there was a time when she and Mr. Alexander had an altercation. And I believe it was the altercation when he purportedly pushed her down to the ground and choked her. From that point on, she said she would fear him at times, especially when he got angry, and she would begin to either shake or have sweaty hands. But but those symptoms began to occur with greater regularity after the actual killing incident.
Follow-up from the defense.
Good afternoon, Dr. Samuels.
Good afternoon.
You were just talking about the physiological symptoms that she reported. One of those the shaking or tremors.
Yes.
And did she talk to you about those? Why did those occur? Why did those begin to occur?
She indicated to me that they occurred after an incident with Mr. Alexander when he pushed her down and choked her. And from that time, his anger became associated with fear, and she reacted. One of the reactions was to experience the tremors.
All right. And with regard to the anger and the fear that she felt, is this something that she described for you from the beginning of your meetings?
Yes.
And is this something she talked to you about even though she was still telling the intruder story?
Yes.
Okay. So when you first met with her, was she being forthright to you about beginning to talk to you about the relationship with Travis?
Yes.
I reused another word.
Yes, she began to describe details of the relationship with me from the very beginning of our contacts.
All right. And then after, when she told you what she says actually happened on June 4th of 2008, did you still talk to her about her relationship with Travis?
Yes, because they were additions to what was being told to me. She had made that breakthrough and was revealing more to me at that time.
Okay. You were asked the question about how can you be sure that she didn't kill him from jealousy. Do you remember that question?
Yes.
And you talked about some of the things that that supported the idea that there was no jealousy involved. Is that right?
Yes.
Did you listen to a tape recording between Mr. Alexander and Miss Arias?
Yes.
And in that tape recording, did they discuss marrying other people?
Yes.
Did they discuss whether or not Mr. Alexander was actually going to go to Cancun?
Yes.
And when they're talking about Mr. Alexander going to Cancun, did Miss Arias ever say anything negative to Mr. Alexander on that tape?
No, she did not.
Did she ever on that tape express any dismay that he was not taking her?
No.
You said you reviewed journal articles as well, right?
Yes.
And in her journal articles, do you recall her speaking specifically about Mr. Alexander not being the person to marry?
Yes, she did mention that in her writings.
And did she talk about that they were going to move on from each other and marry their own people?
They did say that what she said that in her writings.
And what I mean is marry different people.
Marry different people.
Okay. You said that she was, the trip, ultimately starting on June 2nd, she was going to visit another man.
Yes.
Were you aware through text messages and speaking with Jodi, were you aware that she was already cultivating a relationship with this other man?
Yes, I'm aware of that.
And was she speaking with him through text messages and phone
Yes.
calls? And she was doing this prior to the trip to Utah, wasn't she?
Yes.
Are you aware of her moving away from Mr. Alexander?
I am.
And once she moved away from Mr. Alexander back to California, did you review text messages during that time talking about how good she felt?
Yes, she said that she felt better being away.
And is that in any way indicative of jealousy?
No.
You just were talking to us about being thrown during testimony, talking about the PSD test and whether or not you should have given it again. When you had some time to review the answers on the PSD test, knowing what Jodi tells you happened on June 4th of 2008, do you have any concerns that PSD test would have come out not supporting PTSD?
No, I believe that there's an extremely high probability that the score would have remained the same.
Is it possible that the score could have been higher?
It could have been.
And with the PSD test, is the concern what the facts of the trauma or whether there is a trauma?
What it's measuring is whether or not there was a trauma and how seriously did that trauma affect you and in what ways. But the specificity of the trauma is really more of a therapeutic issue. Given the fact that both were terrible, the original story was bad enough, but the real story was even worse. So you would anticipate that the trauma would have been even greater.
And is there any doubt in your mind that she suffered a trauma on June 4th of 2008?
No doubt whatsoever.
And so if she suffered a trauma on June 4th of 2008, the answers on that PSD test, are you confident in the results?
I'm confident enough for the purposes I used the test for, which was basically to confirm my decision to diagnose her with a PTSD diagnosis.
And you talked a little bit about that. You talked a little bit about making a hypothesis first.
Yes.
Do you remember that?
I do.
All right. So when psychologists or doctors need to make or diagnose somebody, see if there's something wrong with a patient, Do you walk in and give them a battery of tests?
That's not typically how it's done, no.
Why not?
Well, you don't know what tests to give. The purpose of tests is to refine your initial hypothesis. And so the first few interviews are very important in helping you formulate your thinking. Now, with a certain amount of experience and having worked with many people who have these disorders, it becomes relatively easy to recognize the presence of PTSD, because in your mind, you're comparing what they're telling you and what's going on with them with the criteria from the DSM. So as soon as I had indicated earlier, I had a previous diagnosis, perhaps a dissociative identity disorder. I eliminated that one as we spoke further. So PTSD came up next. I began to ask questions over and over again to make certain that was the case. Then I administered the 2 tests, which supported it, and that confirmed the diagnosis for me.
You also mentioned that whether or not you gave the test, would you still feel comfortable diagnosing Jodi with PTSD?
In most of the therapy work that I do, we don't do psychological, I don't do that much therapy anymore, but we didn't do psychotherapy routinely, in part because the insurance companies were reluctant to pay for testing. In those cases where I did use testing, I would very often administer it several weeks into the work, not so much for the diagnostic purpose, but to get a little bit more second opinion about that individual's certain characteristics, such as their personality, their emotional state, the level of anxiety, and so on, which I would use as a second opinion. Because when you do psychotherapy, you work on your own, you're pretty much on your own. And in order to reduce the risk of bias or heading off in the wrong direction, the use of a psychological test can serve a useful purpose.
Okay. You talked about experience, and that experience is helpful when talking with a patient or a client about, when they're talking to you about their experiences and their symptoms.
Yes.
Do you think it's similar to a medical doctor when somebody walks into a medical doctor and says that they have, pains somewhere? Doesn't that medical doctor want to know where the pains are first before they send the person out for tests?
Absolutely.
There's medical expertise.
Approach. Sustained.
In times past, when you have visited a doctor, do they immediately send you out for testing, or do they ask you questions first to know what kind of medical test to give you?
Well, the proper approach would be to learn as much as you can.
Not answering the question.
When you visited a doctor, generally speaking, when you've gone to a doctor, do they want to know what your symptoms are first before they send you out for maybe an x-ray or something?
Of course, yes.
Okay. And is that similar in the world of psychology?
Yes, we ask for the presenting problem or the issue that they would like to deal with in therapy. And if we feel that testing is appropriate, we might order a test. Certainly, we would delve into an area that is of greatest concern to the patient.
All right. And so when you have experience, such as the amount of experience that you have, 35 years, does that come into play when you're listening to these people talking about their symptoms?
Absolutely. A well-experienced physician, psychologist, is able to listen to the story of the patient and probably with greater clarity have a better idea as to what the problems are with that individual because they've seen it before, they've heard it before. Now, your diagnostic procedure doesn't stop there, but at least you are probably likely to more quickly zero in on the actual problem of the individual because you've heard it hundreds of times before or dozens of times before. And I noticed that in my own practice as well.
Okay. You were asked the question, in a fight or flight situation, why would Jodi have run into the closet versus running out the door? In that type of situation, when a person is in fight or flight, are they able to make higher level decisions?
You know, the better analogy, I think, the best analogy for what happens during fight or flight is to imagine an animal who is frightened, running away from the source of the fear, and then finding itself cornered, fighting back. And this is going on without a lot of conscious planning and decision. And when a person is in a fight or flight state, the old part of the brain, that central core of the brain, is what predominates because the cerebral cortex, the area of the brain that's responsible for our higher level thinking, is not functioning properly. So the first thing to do is to put distance. That's the first built-in instruction. Put a distance between the negative situation and yourself for safety. So you run, you flee. Which direction do you go? It's hard to determine that. If you've had experience, for example, running in one direction, but in the past you've been trapped in that direction, well, maybe subconsciously your body chooses to go into another direction. It's hard to predict. It's hard to know exactly how a person is going to behave because the behavior isn't rational. So from what I understand about the construction of that house, the closet was not a dead end. It was a passageway between two rooms, and it offered an egress from the situation. So it's consistent with fight or flight.
Okay. You said that often people want to put distance between the attack or the fear and themselves. Did Jodi talk to you about wanting to put distance between herself and Travis?
Yes.
And you said something about past experiences that can make a subconscious difference?
Yes.
Did Jodi ever talk to you about trying to get out of that room in another time and Travis catching her before she could get to the door?
Yes.
Is that something that matters in her body? Not necessarily her conscious decision making, but is that something that would matter during a fight or flight situation?
It could. If there was an experience where an attempt to escape was made, and certainly from what I've read and understood and what I was told, it didn't lead to a total acute stress disorder, but it was a negative experience. It's possible that the motor learning, the motor conditioning, or the reflexive type of conditioning became somewhat stronger to flee in a particular direction, a direction different from the one that didn't work the first time. Now, this is a hypothesis that I'm making, and so I don't know for sure, but it's possible. It's entirely possible that that's why that happened.
All right. And you also said that behaviors are not rational during a fight or flight situation. So we can sit here and guess all day, right, about whether or not why did she turn to the closet versus turning to the door. But ultimately, if there's irrational behavior happening during a fight or flight situation, I mean, is it possible that people would never know?
That's true.
Or never an explanation?
No, any explanation, you're explaining something that is below the level of consciousness. It happens. We don't know why. Even if we look back at it within the context of what we know about the individual, we can never be sure. And we can never offer a clear-cut, 100% guaranteed explanation of why someone did A instead of B.
But what you do know about a person being in the fight or flight situation is that their decision making. What do you know about their decision making?
That the decision making is basically occurring on the instinctual survival level. It's typically not associated with higher level processing.
And when you talk about not behaving rationally, can you look at situations to see if they seem like they were rational situations or not?
Yes.
And a photographer leaving a camera in a washer with all the pictures showing that she was there that day, is that something rational?
Objection, lack of foundation, mental state.
It's not a mental state question.
You may continue.
Thank you. If somebody is in the fight or flight situation, and you're telling us that their behavior is not always rational then, would it be rational, would it be considered rational then in that, well, is it rational for a person who is at a crime scene to leave evidence behind that they were at the crime scene? Is that a rational thing to do?
No.
Is that something that would be considered irrational?
I would, yes, I would consider it irrational.
And if they're leaving information at the scene that leads detectives right up to them to say that you were there, is that something that is well thought out?
No.
You were asked questions about, one more question about that. With regard to asking for help, you said it would be something that a brain in a fight or flight situation would not stop to make a phone call. Is that what you said?
There was no time either. You know, when you're under threat, and milliseconds count. So to interrupt what you're doing, pulling out a phone and dialing someone, or 911 or whatever, is not in itself possible under those circumstances. Besides which, when you're in a fight or flight situation, you've probably seen this in the movies, people get very nervous, they can't press the buttons properly, they're not thinking, they are awash in instinctual, reflexive behaviors and thoughts and feelings, I should say. And doing things that are more rational, which require planning, generally do not occur under those conditions.
And to your knowledge, based on your review of the police reports, was anybody home at the time that this occurred when this happened with Jodi?
No.
So there was no one there to help her?
Faint.
Was there anyone there to help her?
To my knowledge, there was no one else in the house other than Mr. Alexander and Ms. Arias.
Okay. You were asked questions about, would you be comfortable diagnosing a person who continues to be untruthful? Do you remember that line?
Yes.
And have you had that situation happen to you?
Only with some adolescents, and then I ask their parents to come in, and usually we resolve it, but there have been a few cases where I've sent them elsewhere. But at least in a therapeutic situation, people are paying good money and giving of their time and commitment, so it's less likely that they're going to be anything but honest. But I have had some circumstances like that. Sometimes people are embarrassed to reveal, which is one of the reasons I don't tape, because people are more likely to open up if they feel they're just talking to a person and their words are not being recorded for posterity.
And when you have those situations, what do you do?
Well, you say, listen, there's some inconsistencies in your story, and I want you to think about why it is that you're telling me those things. Is it something that you're embarrassed about, or are you, basically you confront them in a gentle, assertive manner, but not in an aggressive manner. And hopefully that will give them enough opening to begin to revise that. Say, listen, are you sure that's the way it really went? Because I seem to recall this and that. And, you know, you try to engage them in a friendly conversation, and you usually get far more information, as they say, you catch more flies with sugar than with vinegar. So the idea is to engage them and make them feel comfortable. However, there are times, especially with rowdy adolescents, where they may be resistant, they may be fighting the therapy, they may be there only because their parents want them there. And in those cases, I would have to say, after a period of time, maybe you really need to see someone else. But of course, you take the intervening step of dealing with the parents.
Okay.
But most adults don't do that.
All right. Did you ever have that problem with Jodi?
No.
And what about when she was telling you the intruder story?
Objection, characterization, coaching.
Approach. World.
So what about when she was telling you the intruder story? Did you have to have these conversations with her about gently confronting her, or what did you do?
Initially, the most that I would do is say, are you sure that that's what happened? But I didn't want to push it because I was taking the view that this was likely a psychological defense mechanism. And I didn't want to push her into having confront the very stimuli that I hypothesized would have caused this new alternative reality. However, on her own, she finally changed her story. What those factors were, I don't know. But then when I went back to her after she did make the revelation and began questioning her, I found a different demeanor. She told me that she felt that a tremendous weight had been lifted. She began to reveal more details about the story. And at that point, I began to expand what I wrote. I didn't have to revise my diagnosis because I had made the same diagnosis earlier, although the incident was different. Trauma was different, but this was an even more intense trauma. And I had assumed that there was a greater trauma than she was originally telling me anyway.
Okay. So is there a difference then between the adolescent who is just simply not cooperating with you or lying to you and the situation that happened with Jodi when she's talking to you about the intruder story?
No, I believe that the intruder story was a psychological defense mechanism. It was the manifestation of a psychological defense mechanism to protect herself from having to deal with the situation that caused her so much distress.
Okay. And when you have that adolescent who's just not willing, is that, do you characterize everything as a defense mechanism?
No.
Okay.
Not at all.
Okay. And why did you think it was a defense mechanism? Why did you have that hypothesis or
Well,
that
in
opinion?
a diagnosis of PTSD, you find that an individual will very often try to avoid dealing with the stimuli that bring them in contact with the emotional characteristics of what they went through. And I saw this as a very well-constructed, but well-constructed defense mechanism. This was her way of dealing with it. It didn't happen. Somebody else did it. Whereas all the evidence was pointing to the fact that she did do it, but she couldn't deal with that because it was so horrific and so antithetical to everything that I read about in her writings that she simply couldn't face it and couldn't come clean until adequate time had passed. Maybe she reprocessed her thinking. I really don't know what brought the change about, but if it was therapy, it would have been considered a therapeutic breakthrough.
And just to be clear, it wasn't therapy, is that right?
It was not therapy, no.
Okay. you were asked the question, if a patient lied consistently and then take the PDS test, if it's not, would that be then a fictitious result? And I know we've discussed it somewhat, but you answered in that particular question that the PDS is not based on the nature of the trauma. What do you mean?
Well, in other words, there are several different traumas listed there. But if a trauma, in a sense, is a trauma, there was a murder committed. She was witness to that, at least, the least of the traumas. And she was frightened and terrified and felt her life was threatened.
You're talking about the intruder story.
I'm talking about the intruder story.
Okay.
So I knew that there had been this incident. So I realized that indeed, according to her story, which I didn't fully believe, her life was threatened. She was the witness to a horrific crime. Those things would have remained the same, whether she was the actor in the killing or whether or not she was an observer, a sole observer, an observer of the killing. So when she finally came through and told the right story, I can only surmise that the trauma that she experienced was actually worse than it would have been if it was the actuality was the story that she had made up.
Okay. You were asked questions about the MCMI and the validity scales.
Yes.
And when was the MCMI test created?
In the 1970s, I believe.
Okay, and how long does it take to create a test like this?
It can take 10 years, and it's constantly under modification. New norms are being developed. They might start to validate it against different populations so that it broadened the validity of the test. Sometimes tests have to, this is, by the way, MCMI 3 means this is the third version of the test. Soon, I suspect, there'll be an MCI 4. Sometimes the way the items are written have to be modernized. So instead of talking about a phonograph, they might talk about a music player. And but although those items don't exist on the test, I'm using that as an example. So sometimes, for various reasons, the tests go through an evolutionary process. When they reach a point when they're not similar enough to the former version, then you come up with a new version.
Okay, and so you were asked the question about what if the normed population were able to lie on the test, originally when the test was being created, would that create a loophole for people taking the test? My question is let's start first with what's the normed population?
It's a population, and the test is constructed, if I may explain how the test is constructed.
If that makes it easier to
understand. It does make it easier. The items on the test, and there was a pool of many more than 175 items, although they ultimately selected this 175 items based on the items that best correlated with the diagnostic criteria, were given these items, and an analysis was done of how these people with a particular type of diagnosis answer these items, these questions. And so through a complex computational process, certain items are selected, and constellations of items and the relationship between scores and scales allows the test to make a prediction that if somebody who has never taken this test before scores in a manner that is similar to the pattern responded to by people with a known diagnostic category, then we can say that these people have characteristics similar with people with that particular diagnostic category. And this is a very complex and long process. Okay. But nonetheless, the final test allows us to take a standard group of items, ask people to respond to them, and then, using the algorithms that are used to compare and contrast these different scores, make predictions as to what type of diagnostic category is this person responding most like compared to the sample group that we knew for sure had that particular diagnostic category.
Okay, so that's my question. So the sample group that originated the test, that was created, or the sample group that was used in creating the test, that sample group, the question that you were asked is, if that sample group lied, would it create a loophole for later on when people are using this test? What my question to you is that even possible?
I mean, these people who develop these tests are very smart, and No, that's not really possible.
And if it were somehow possible, are we talking about thousands of people getting together and conspiring to answer the test in a certain way?
You'd have to train people to answer in a way that distorts the result. It's a very unlikely proposition.
Okay. The validity scales on the MCMI test, what are they testing for, the validity scales?
Well, they're looking at consistencies between similar items. In other words, sometimes the items in the test are offered several times at different points during the test. They might be slightly reworded, but we're looking for consistencies in internal consistencies. There's one item in either the MCMI or the MMPI, and I'm deliberately mentioning both because I don't want to give an item away, that says, I've traveled across the Atlantic 30 times in the last year. Well, if you're answering in a random process, in a random way, then your answer might be, yes, I have. And very few people have crossed the Atlantic 30 times in the past year. Maybe there's one person who's been, some people may do that, but not too many. And so items like that are placed within the body of the test to detect distortions and lying and a lack of consistency. In fact, one of the statements the test makes is that the person responded consistently to several similar items placed at different points in the test. And again, these test constructors are very clever about what they do. And however, they can't tell on an absolute basis whether or not that person has ever lied before, or they're lying about something unrelated to the test. You're dealing with the sample of items in the test, and not beyond that.
Okay, so the validity scales, when we're talking about catching someone not being truthful, is that not being truthful with regard to the questions on the test?
Yes.
Okay, and the questions on the test, are they developed to learn about people's personalities?
People basically endorse certain beliefs or concepts or ideas that the test developers have found have served a useful discriminating function.
Okay.
And the selection of those items is first done by using what we call face validity. We choose items that we think might be differential, and then we narrow. When we say we, I have not developed a test. It's not my area of expertise. But eventually, by using correlational techniques, we're able to remove the ones that are not as useful in predicting and focus on developing a test with as many highly correlated items as possible.
Okay, and so when you're talking about the questions, the correlated type questions, these aren't factual questions?
No, they're not. They're not factual questions.
Okay.
Like there's another, this is not a real question, but one similar to it in one of the tests that I mentioned. I like sports magazines. True or false? Why is that important? Well, it turns out that certain people with certain diagnostic categories may tend to prefer sports magazines. Now, that one item by itself means nothing, but in conjunction with 567 other items may mean something. Okay. That's just an example.
Okay. So the validity scales are telling you if that person is reporting honestly with regard to the questions on the test?
That's right.
All right. You were asked a question about whether or not the incident with the rope and her being tied with the rope, if that occurred on the day of the killing on June 4th.
Yes.
Okay. Did she speak to you also about another time that she was tied up with the rope?
Yes, she did.
All right. So there was more than one time.
Yes.
And on the day that she and Travis had used the rope on the day on June 4th, did he use a knife to cut the length of the rope?
Yes, that was what was reported.
Okay. You were asked questions about low self-esteem. About low self-esteem and whether or not it was common or normal in the population, general population. You said it wasn't normal, but it can be common. Is that right? Or not uncommon?
It's not uncommon.
Okay. So when you first meet with Jodi, is that something that you could see in her right away?
Well, I can't see it just by looking at her,
Okay.
but after speaking to her at length And having, of course, read much of the material, with the experience of many years of working with people who have low self-esteem, you can pretty quickly determine that. You can sometimes determine it very, very quickly, depending upon eye contact. You can determine it by the strength of the voice. You can determine it by the way they look or not look at you when they're talking. But there are other things that are being said in terms of their explanations of solutions to problems that they have had. There are confident, assertive solutions, there are aggressive solutions, and there are non-assertive solutions. And so after speaking to that individual, you begin to catalog those, if not on paper, then in your brain, and you form an opinion. And my opinion was that she was not a self-confident person.
You talk about assertive and aggressive. Is there a difference between the two?
Yes.
What is the difference?
Well, aggressive responding is that when someone becomes belligerent, they raise their voice, and they attempt to parent the individual, the other person that they're talking to, into submission, almost like an angry parent would be lecturing a child. Whereas an assertive person can get their point across in a rational, friendly, adult-to-adult level. They get the same point across, but they're maintaining adult-to-adult relationships. And that all goes back to an area of parent-to-child relationships, and I won't go into it.
Okay, all right. Is low self-esteem, is that related at all to assertiveness or lack of assertiveness?
Yes, people who are experiencing low self-esteem frequently are not assertive.
And you were asked the question about whether or not if a person was able to confront a boyfriend after cheating on her, is that sign that she's an assertive person? Along with that question was if a person is able to confront another woman who was cheating with her boyfriend, is that a sign of an assertive person?
It depends upon the nature of the interaction. And the fact that Jodi may have spoken to another girlfriend of Mr. Alexander, but didn't do it belligerently, and was basically just speaking to them, may mean that that was a somewhat more assertive act than she typically was capable of engaging in.
Well, let me clarify for a second. With regard to talking to the girlfriend, do you remember her talking to you about a boyfriend named Matt?
Yes.
And did she ever talk to a woman named Bianca, who Matt was seeing?
Yes.
Okay. And so in that situation, if she was able to go and speak with this Bianca person and talk to her about the fact that Bianca was seeing Matt at the same time that Jodi was supposed to be still dating Matt, that's what we're talking about with regard to assertiveness. Does that mean that she's assertive because she's able?
No, it doesn't. And people can be assertive to certain people and not to others. For example, I had a gentleman in therapy who was the CEO of a major New York manufacturer of women's coats. And he probably had 1,500 to 2,000 employees working for him. And he came to see me because he was having trouble dealing with his mother. His mother dominated his life, yet he controlled 1,500 employees. And this was a dilemma for him. He was assertive in the world that he created as an adult, but when it came to the parent-child relationship, he was still the child and his mother was the parent. So the therapy dealt with him becoming more assertive with his mother. So it's perfectly not unusual at all for someone to be assertive in one area and not in another. Ms. Arias was not assertive with Mr. Alexander, in part because she viewed him as being so much superior to her.
And if she was able to, are you aware of a time when she walked in, when she saw him making out or kissing another woman?
Yes.
At a time that he was supposedly trying to get her to become involved again with him?
Yes.
And are you aware that she spoke to him about it a day or so later?
Yes.
The fact that she was able to do that, to bring it up to Travis that, hey, I saw what you did, does that make her assertive again with Travis?
It may have been a little peak of assertiveness at that particular moment. I don't know the exact confrontation, the nature of the confrontation, but a lot of women wouldn't put up with a continued and ongoing pattern of interaction that was reported to me in the conversations and reflected in the emails, the text messages, and so forth.
Well, let's say that just 2 months before that, before this situation, they broke up because Miss Arias believed that Mr. Alexander was cheating on her. And then 2 months later, she sees him kissing another woman at the time that he's supposed to be trying to date Miss Arias again. The fact that she's able to speak to him about it, you said is like a peak of assertiveness, right?
Yes.
What about the fact that she, when he apologizes and says he'll change, she stays? Does that say anything about her?
That indicates that her confidence, she's not respecting herself adequately. Self-respect goes hand in hand with self-esteem. And if you love yourself, if you respect yourself, you're not going to allow anyone to take advantage of you over and over and over again. And she was unable to do that.
You talked about the question was the D2 criteria for PTSD, which was irritability,
Yes,
and that Jodi reported that she would be irritable on the phone with her mom.
yes.
With regard to that, and you talked about her showing anger towards her mom.
Yes.
Was she able to show anger to anyone else? Did she have that type of assertiveness or self-esteem to be able to do that?
Rarely.
Was she ever able to show that to Travis during their relationship?
If at all, infrequently.
And if she did ever stand up to him, did she talk to you about what his response would be?
Well, she reported several times that she would be punished for speaking up to him by him not calling her for several days. And because of her low self-esteem, she began to fear that
Thank you, please be seated. Please be seated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. Ms. Wilmot, you may continue.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Samuels, do you remember being asked a question with regard to comparing the PTSD that Jodi suffers to PTSD that can happen with trained soldiers and police officers?
Yes.
And what comparison are you making between the two?
The comparison is that both groups reached the same diagnostic criteria, albeit for very different reasons.
All right. And when somebody experiences a trauma, do they necessarily get PTSD?
No.
What about if the person is trained, the more trained they are to deal with certain traumas?
While they're still vulnerable, there's a decreasing probability of undergoing an acute stress reaction if they are well trained and prepared.
Okay. And if the person, I guess along those lines, if a person has control over the situation where they know what's going to happen, is there a less probability or less likely for that person to then be thrown into an acute stress?
Yes.
Why is that?
Well, normally what occurs is that there's a shock value to certain situations. The person feels threatened first, and then they go after, they may respond by either fleeing or protecting themselves. But if they're planning to kill someone, then the initial reaction is theirs. They don't have the element of surprise. There's more planning involved. And while it may very well be that their reaction to what they just did would be very negative, the likelihood of developing a acute stress reaction and experiencing those severe autonomic changes is lower.
Okay. You talked about when you first, there was a question about when you first learned of Jodi having a physiological response. We're talking about the tremors and the shaking. When you first learned about the fact that she was having tremors or that she was shaking, was it Mr. Nurmi who told you?
Yes.
And after that, did you know to look for it?
That's right. After that point, I made an effort to look at it and see it myself.
And after that, is that when did you discuss it with Jodi after that?
After that, yes.
Is it something that Jodi brought up to you all on your own to show a symptom that she had?
No. I inquired when I first found out about that, and then she told me that she had sweaty palms and also shaking under various different conditions.
Okay, so it's something that she answered your questions after you found out about it?
That's right. I wanted to inquire further because I hadn't noticed it.
Okay. And let's see, with regard to the question about, there must have been some confusion with regard to the 3 to 8 cases per 100,000 people of transient global amnesia.
Yes.
Okay. Did I say that right?
You did.
Okay. Isn't that a small number, 3 to 8
A very
people?
small number, yes.
All right, so what is the point then?
The point was simply to explain to the jury and to show that amnesia is not something that's mysterious, that it can occur under a wide range of circumstances. I indicated that it didn't happen very frequently, but I simply wanted to lay that as a foundation for the further discussion of dissociative amnesia.
Okay. And this particular, where you got that number from, the 3 to 8 out of 100,000, was that contained in a review article?
Yes.
And did that review article contain information from 119 other articles?
Yes.
And that was speaking of generally a type of amnesia, transient global amnesia, is that right?
Correct.
And that type of amnesia, you said, can occur from far less traumatic things.
Yes.
Whereas dissociative amnesia, that occurs from something much more traumatic?
Correct.
You were asked questions about hypnosis.
Yes.
Is hypnosis something that an evaluator typically does?
No, not unless requested. For example, when I consulted with the police departments of the state police in New Jersey, I was infrequently asked to do a hypnotic analysis.
I'm sorry, did you say infrequently?
Infrequently asked,
okay.
yes. It didn't happen very often. And when I was asked to do it, I did because I am proficient in hypnosis. And it was helpful a few times to help certain police officers better recollect the circumstances of the situation in which they were involved with a shooting incident. But it didn't really help the investigation all that much, and it was never clear whether they were just confabulating that or making it up based upon things that were said or things that they heard about. I did use hypnosis in the case of a young, maybe a 10-year-old girl who was accused of killing her mother, and to try to get some information from her. And in that case, it was more useful.
Okay. Is hypnosis something that would be done more in therapy?
Yes.
And so is that why you're not frequently asked to do it as an evaluator?
Well, its value is limited, and the information that you get from hypnosis is generally not considered reliable, and it is subject to cross-examination, and it doesn't stand up. It's a pretty good therapeutic tool, by the way. Hypnosis can be very effective in controlling anxiety, depression, habit control, and so on. But as a forensic technique, it has its limits.
All right. And were you doing any kind of therapy with Jodi?
None whatsoever.
You were asked a question about whether other doctors do you know if other doctors would have a different opinion with regard to your diagnosis of PTSD for Jodi? Do you remember that question?
Yes, I do remember that question.
All right. And other doctors with your experience level, do you have an idea of whether or not they would have differing opinions from your diagnosis?
Objection, not recommendation.
Approach.
Doctor, when other doctors are looking at making a diagnosis, and psychologists in particular, are they all using, to make a diagnosis, are they all using the same criteria that you would use?
Yes,
And is that criteria located in the DSM?
yes,
And so if the criteria, if you find that the criteria exists pursuant to the DSM, is there a likelihood of doctors with the same experience level who are listening to the same things that you're listening to, is there a likelihood that they would find the same criteria?
if they had the opportunity to review all of the material and to interview the client in a similar manner, yes, I would have a great deal of confidence that they would find the same diagnosis as me.
Okay. During one of the questions you asked about, you talked about an assessment. How can you make an assessment if the person is lying?
I recall.
And you talked about that you've been doing these evaluations and therapy, things like that, for over 35 years, and some of the things that you look at in order to make these assessments.
Yes.
Okay. What are some of the things that you look at to make these assessments?
Well, you look at the consistency of the reporting. You look at the ancillary information, whatever that may be. In some cases, it might be a spouse or other family members. It might be a diary. It might be text messages or emails. Comments with significant people, discussions with significant people in their lives, and you try to form a pattern. And if the things that you're being told are consistent with that which was told to you by others, then you have to attribute a higher level of likelihood that what they are telling with you is true.
Okay. One of the questions that you were asked dealt with how do you know, based on, we're talking about Jodi's journals, how do you know that nothing negative, and we saw some of the negative writings, but nothing overly negative, how do you know that nothing overly negative was written in her journals isn't because nothing negative ever happened? Do you remember that question?
I do.
And did you review text messages and emails besides speaking to Jodi? Did you look at other things? Did you look at other things other than speaking with Jodi to learn about some negative experiences?
I did.
And in doing that, did you run across text messages between Jodi and Travis?
I did.
And in these text messages, did you see certain ways that Travis would treat Jodi?
Yes.
And I'm showing you exhibit number 444. This is a text message that we've already established previously, that this is a text message coming from Travis to Jodi.
Yes.
And do you see where he's talking to her about do not call me, do not text me anything?
Yes.
Oops, hold on.
Right up on top.
Yeah. And that anything else matters about all the crazy things you've done, so either fess up or feel my wrath, or feel the wrath. You see that?
Is that the middle of the page there?
Oh, I'm sorry.
There it is, down there. Okay, yes, I see it.
And that no matter how bad the truth is, I promise you the punishment will be better than the lie.
Yes.
Is this type of behavior threatening behavior?
You could,
Can it be considered threatening behavior by somebody who is receiving it?
yes.
I'm showing you what's been entered into evidence as Exhibit 445. Do you see the incoming where it says, it doesn't sound to me It doesn't sound to me like to me, that's being dramatic, dear. Call me ASAP. Do you see that?
Yes,
And then the outgoing message, which means it's coming from Travis to Jodi. Do not call back. I'm sick of you playing stupid and dealing with childish tactics. You see that?
yes,
And then he goes on, in the next part of the long text message, he talks about how she's ruining yet another day of his. Do you see that in the beginning?
I do.
And do you see where he talks about bitter feelings are brewing in me towards you? Do you
Yes.
see that? And he's sick of having days ruined by her.
Yes,
And that he's going to have a genuine dislike for her.
yes,
And do you see where he starts talking about revenge?
yes,
Are these things that, being received by someone else, can these be considered negative or mean?
yes.
Are these types of comments hurtful? Can they be considered hurtful?
Sure.
I'm showing you it's been entered as exhibit number 450. This is another of a text fight, and I'm looking specifically in the middle, where he talks about, by the way, your pick comment to Danny Jones makes you look like a pure whore. You see that?
I do.
Is that something that is a pleasantry that people exchange between each other?
No.
And if he knew what I knew about you, he'd spit in your face. That's not a pleasantry, is it?
Not loving words, no.
And to call somebody evil.
It's a very negative assessment.
And are you aware from reading other instant chat mail and emails and things like that of the different names that Jodi was called by Travis?
I am.
Names like slut,
Yes,
whore,
yes,
bitch,
yes,
three-hole wonder.
yes.
Those kind of names and this type of behavior. Did you ever see any writing like this in her journals?
Absolutely nothing like it whatsoever.
And so when you are talking about her not writing negative experiences in her journals, are these some of the things that you are talking about?
She was always writing her journal to make Travis look good.
Did she ever talk to you about why she did that?
Well, yes, she did.
Why is that?
Well, she respected him, she loved him, she hoped that she could be part of his life, and she was hopeful that he would eventually change.
And is that something she talked about, that his hope for change?
Yes, that was part of her conversation.
And somebody who has a loved one speak to them in this way, is that, and then doesn't do anything, stays in the relationship until the next time they're spoken to in this manner, does that speak to their assertiveness and their self-esteem?
Absolutely.
What does it say about it?
It says that they have low self-esteem and that they're not assertive. Not assertive at all.
You remember you were asked some questions about the testing, questions 16 through 21.
Yes.
All right, I'm showing you exhibit 540,
Yes.
which shows questions 16 through 21, and the exhibit 540 is these are the questions on the PDS test.
Yes.
And these questions, 16 through 21, they speak to a trauma, is that right?
That's correct.
And you had talked earlier about when a person is speaking of a trauma, does it necessarily matter the specifics of the trauma?
Not if you're talking about one type of trauma over another. In my professional opinion, they were close enough. And so what she was reporting when she took this test was likely that which she experienced during the trauma, even though she attributed the cause of the trauma to something else.
So even though she was talking at the time that she takes this test about intruders still, When she answers the questions 16 through 21, based on what you know, what she says actually happened, did you feel comfortable of whether or not these answers would change?
Objection, speculation.
Overruled.
Yes, I was pretty confident that they would remain roughly the same.
All right. And then ultimately, if they remained roughly the same, did the testing result, which confirmed your hypothesis for PTSD, does that remain the same as well?
That's right, yes.
All right. Thank you. No further questions.
Mr. Martinez.
Sir, one of the things that you told us with regard to the PTSD was that, the other time was that, well, yes, I would have administered it had I thought about it, right? That's what you told us, right?
I did say that.
And sir, with regard to that, you also said that you provided us with some raw data, right? Remember questions being asked about the raw data in that particular test?
That particular test?
The PDS test?
Overruled.
Do you remember that?
I did not supply the defense team with the raw data.
No, I'm not asking about that. Do you remember that you made a comment about lawyers coming in possession of raw data? Do you remember that during the question from the jury?
Well, we discussed it,
Yes,
yes.
yes or no?
Yes, we discussed it.
And with regard to that, you said it's because they wouldn't understand it, right? You said that, right?
Well, that's one component.
Sure, but you said it here in court, right?
I don't recall specifically.
Objection, Judge. Beyond the scope. May we approach?
You may approach.
May continue.
There is raw data that's associated with the PDS test, correct?
Yes.
Let's take a look at that raw data. So this is Exhibit 550. Take a look at it and see if you recognize that as the raw data involving the PDS test that you said did not need to be re-administered today.
Yes, that's it.
And this one actually contains the little circles filled in, right?
Yep.
I move for the admission of Exhibit 550.
Judge, may we approach?
Yes. Be submitted.
Sir, let's take a look at Exhibit 550 and the worksheet that's associated with that. If you take a look at it, at the PTSD diagnostic criteria A through F met. Do you see that question there?
Yes,
Do you see the number of symptoms endorsed? It says maximum 17. Do you see that?
yes,
And it says 17 there, doesn't it?
yes, it does.
Let's take a look at the other one that you provided to me on a separate date back on March 18th of 2008. I'm sorry, 2013, this year, Exhibit 535. Let's take a look at that. This is Jodi Arias. Do you see that? Same question, post-traumatic stress disorder diagnostic criteria, A through F met?
Yes, I
Question.
scored that twice.
Sir, numbers are different, aren't they?
Yes, I scored that twice.
You're making all of these changes, aren't you, sir?
No,
Sustained.
Sir, that's a change, isn't it? From one, yes or no?
I rescored it twice.
Yes or no, that's a change, right?
It's a change.
And you only disclosed one of the changes, didn't you?
Objection as to disclosure, Judge. These weren't disclosed to begin with.
Sustained.
Sir, the numbers do not coincide, do they?
That's correct. I scored it twice.
And sir, you did tell us, though, that with regard to this particular test, there was no need to re-administer this PDS test because, in your opinion, if the new information came out or the changed information came out, well then, to you, she would have exhibited more of the traumatic events or a higher score. Do you remember testifying to that in
I
response?
suggested that, yes.
But sir, if we take a look at exhibit number 550, isn't she already at the maximum 17? How could she possibly go higher than 17?
I don't recall, and I don't know that I have a date on there, but what I did was that I calculated it
Sir,
twice. And I counted.
Judge, he's being non-responsive.
No, Judge, he's trying to answer the question.
Thank you. I had misplaced that particular worksheet. And in preparation for testimony, I decided to rescore it. And I rescored it, and the score may be different by a point or two, but both scores meet the criteria. There's no difference in terms of the outcome of that test based on the score of 17 or 15.
First of all, did you tell us when we were talking about exhibit 535 that you had misplaced the original? You didn't tell us that, did you?
I don't recall that I did, no.
And with regard to when you testified today, my question is much more direct. Isn't it true that in response to a question from the jury, you were asked, well, if this other story was known at the time that you took this PDS, would the scores be the same? Do you remember being asked about that?
I did, yes, I
And
was.
do you remember saying in response to that question, well, it's not really something that you were concerned with, and the reason you weren't concerned with it was because you said that she would have scored higher anyway, right? Didn't you say that?
What I was referring to,
Yes or no?
I
sir?
can't answer yes or no, sir.
You don't remember saying that to a response to a juror's question, yes or no? And if you do remember, yes, and if
I
you
don't remember.
do you have problems with your memory then?
No, sir, no more problems than you do.
Sir,
Overruled. The answer will stand.
Sir, with regard to this issue, have you conducted a diagnostic test on the prosecutor?
No, I have not.
How would you know about his memory problems if he has any?
I'm not saying that you are.
Sustained.
Sir, one of the things that you told us was that you were, when you went to see the defendant, one of the things that happened was that you gave her a book, right?
That is correct.
And you said that you were a compassionate man. Do you remember saying that in response to a juror's
Yes, I
question?
have been accused of that by many.
I'm not asking you if you've been accused of anything. I'm asking you whether or not, in response to a juror's question, you said that you were a compassionate man.
Yes, I did.
And with regard to compassion, isn't that just sympathy for an other individual and whatever situation they may be in?
Perhaps.
Well, no, you're the one that used the word compassion.
Well, I'm
So,
not sure that compassion and sympathy mean the same thing.
well, perhaps if we take a look at a definition from Webster and see whether or not it coincides with yours, all right?
Okay.
Take a look at exhibit number 551. It has a couple of definitions of compassion.
Yes, I see that.
Okay?
Yes.
If I may have it back. Doesn't it say that compassion could be sympathy for the distress of another?
Yes.
And so when you said that you had compassion, you told us that you had sympathy for the defendant, didn't you?
Well, that's Webster's definition. I use the word compassionate.
Right, and we just talked about how Webster defines compassion, right? Are you,
Correct.
Objection, Your Honor. This is beyond the scope.
Overruled.
are you saying that you have a different definition of compassion than Webster's?
I'll go by Webster's definition.
All right, so Webster then talks about sympathy for the distress of another, right?
That's correct.
And so you said that you gave the book to this defendant after your first meeting with her, right?
Correct.
And so that means that, and how long did that first meeting last?
2, 3 hours, 4 hours perhaps.
What was the date?
I can look that up.
Go ahead.
Yeah, 12/16/09.
State moves to the admission of exhibit 551.
551 is admitted.
Let's take a look at the definition. You see that?
Absolutely.
It says sympathetic consciousness of others' distress together with a desire to alleviate it, right?
Yes.
So what this says is that you now want to alleviate the defendant's distress, right?
My nature is to help people who are in trouble.
And that's therapeutic, isn't it?
No, it is not. It is
Well,
a desire on my part. Therapy is a process. There was no process of therapy conducted.
It's a desire on your part. And that's part of the bias or the thoughts that you take into this evaluation, right?
My training of 35 years has taught me not to inject any bias whatsoever in the impartial evaluations that I conduct.
And that training in 35 years has also taught you to omit certain things from your reports, right?
Like omit what?
Like in finding PTSD. Let's take a look at that. Hold on. Exhibit number 544, that training of 35 years that you're talking about, sir. Didn't that training of 35 years teach you to be accurate?
I absolutely, but I didn't have training as a typist, and I omitted a couple of numbers, which I then corrected prior to coming to court.
And you however, release this report for publication
I
to
did.
other sides, didn't you?
I did, yes.
And you did that even though you had the opportunity to review it, right?
I didn't review the specifics of that section until I started to prepare for trial, when my review revealed to me that I had omitted 2 of the criteria that were otherwise listed in the body of the report.
Nothing precluded you from reviewing that before you made it a final copy, did it?
That's true. I omitted those numbers and letters, and I made an error.
And in 35 years of experience, doesn't that experience teach you to be very careful in going over your reports?
It does, and I was, but I obviously missed those. There are
And
other-
in fact, you know that these are reports that people are going to rely on, right?
Yes,
And you've testified other times with regard to reports, correct?
absolutely.
And the accuracy of the report is something that you know is sacrosanct, isn't it?
That's right.
But you failed that in this particular case with regard to this report.
I did omit those letters and numbers.
So, it does talk about, in this case, a desire to alleviate someone's distress. A desire to alleviate someone's distress is an indication of sympathy, isn't it?
According to Webster,
How about according to you?
the sympathy for me means more like feeling sorry for someone.
Okay, so you felt sorry for the defendant after the first meeting then?
No, I didn't. I felt a sense of compassion.
A sense of compassion means that you felt sorry for her, isn't it?
Objection as to the answer.
I saw a person who was having a great deal of difficulty. I felt that it would help my evaluation if I sent her this book, and that was the full extent of my interaction with her that in any way could be considered therapeutic.
I'm not asking about the book right now. I'm asking about your feelings towards the defendant. That's what I'm asking about right now. And those feelings that you exhibited for the defendant were such that you felt a desire to alleviate whatever distress she was under.
I did so by getting her a book.
But the answer is, you did feel that way, right?
My initial impression was that this was someone who would benefit from that book.
Your initial impression after talking to her was that you felt sorry for her.
Not necessarily sorry for her. I felt that this was a woman who was alone and isolated, and by reading that book, it might help with the accuracy of my report and make her more likely to be able to come to terms with an issue that she was protecting herself from psychologically by creating an alternative reality.
So you feel that your role is that of a support group then, right?
No.
Well, you said she was alone. You just said that. That you
That's
believe
my-
that she was alone and isolated. Did you just not say that?
I did say that.
And if somebody is alone and isolated, you try to take care of that, didn't you?
I offered her, I gave her a book that I felt would make my evaluation more accurate and more complete.
Didn't you just tell me that you felt that she was alone and isolated after the first meeting?
Objection as to the answer.
Yeah, if that's what I said, that's what I said.
And because of that, you decided to do something about it, right?
Yes.
And that doesn't have anything to do with anything other than what you're feeling at the time, does it?
No, because I've been trained to disconnect any feelings that I might have from the objectivity of an evaluation. This isn't something that we learn how to do, and I've been doing it long enough to know that sending someone a book that I think might be helpful for them, which in the long run would help me and the accuracy of my evaluation, is not a situation where I'm creating therapy or giving them support, because nothing was ever talked about other than once she told me she was reading the book.
When you were describing an answer to the question from a jury, didn't you use the word of breakthrough, that she had a breakthrough, and then you continued with talking to her? Didn't you say that?
Yes,
Objection mischaracterizes his testimony.
Overruled.
that mischaracterizes what I said. What I said, that if this was therapeutic, if it was a therapy, if it occurred during someone's therapy, it would have been considered a breakthrough.
But just because you say that the word therapy isn't being used, the fact that she changed stories after reading this book because you gave her that book because you felt sorry, that's not considered therapeutic at all, right?
Objection mischaracterizes the evidence of changing stories just after she read the book.
Overruled. Let me answer.
It took several visits and many months before she changed her story. and she didn't reveal the new story to me. She referred to it, she told her attorney about it, who then informed me. Whether the book had anything to do with that, I have no idea.
I don't want to know anything about anybody else other than you. Can we just, in other words, what you knew in talking to the defendant? That's what I'm interested in. So after the first meeting, that's when you decide to send her the book, right?
Correct.
After the first meeting, you then had another conversation with her, right?
Yes.
When was that?
When was that?
Yes.
The next,
Approach, please. May continue.
And during that second meeting, you still had those feelings of sympathy, didn't you?
Objection beyond scope.
Overruled.
no, we talked about things that were related to the evaluation, and my feelings were not of concern during this evaluation. I was simply collecting information and data from her.
I know you say your feelings were of no concern, but if you had these feelings for her when you first started to talk to her, are you now telling us that those feelings changed the second time?
We are trained extensively to deal with our own personal feelings and to disregard them and put them aside in order to conduct an objective evaluation, which is precisely what I did, and I had no further feelings of compassion once I ordered the book for her, because I felt I discharged the duty that I felt I needed to do for this particular person, and that was it.
And that wasn't my question, now was it?
That was my answer to your question.
And my question to you was, did those feelings of sympathy that you had to start this evaluation, isn't it true that they still existed during the second meeting that you had with her?
No.
Objection mischaracterizes the evidence of feelings of sympathy. He's telling him over and over again he did not have feelings of sympathy. He's mischaracterizing it. Overruled, the answer will stand.
And you continued, when was the first meeting? You gave me the first date, it was what?
It was the 16th of December, 2009.
And you continued seeing her, in fact, till there was this last meeting, again, in response to the follow-up, that there was another meeting in December of 2012, correct?
Let me just confirm that.
Well,
Yes.
and so what was the date of the first meeting again?
The first meeting was December 16th, 2010.
So you not consistently, you met with her the first time in December of 2010 till the last time, December of 2012, correct?
Correct.
So that's a period of 2 years, right?
Correct.
Sir, one of the things that you did during this course of evaluation that you're talking about is, in response to a question by the jury, was that you administered this PDS test, right?
Yes.
And one of the things that you were asked by the jury was, well, why didn't you do it again? Basically was the question. Do you remember being asked that?
Yes.
And your answer to that was, well, the answers would have been the same, right?
Yes.
And the answers would have been the same because you said it didn't matter what the triggering event was. That's what you said, right?
That's correct. In my opinion, in this case, it didn't matter.
So what you're saying is the event, whether it was her killing or or these two other individuals coming in, that didn't matter, right? The story didn't matter.
For the purposes of my scoring, of using a test which simply confirmed my hypothesis, which was made previously, it didn't matter to me.
And this hypothesis that you had of PTSD, that was formed at the first meeting, wasn't it?
No, it wasn't.
Well, when was it formed, this hypothesis that you keep telling us about?
Several months into the evaluation.
And you say that exhibit number 540, that her answer, being number 4, non-sexual assault by a stranger, really is not important in this assessment of PTSD, right?
Correct. Based for my use.
Pardon?
For my purposes, it didn't make that much of a difference.
And so she could have said, based on what you're telling us, that 20 people came in and committed this horrific act on Mr. Alexander, and that also would not have changed your opinion of what was going on in terms of scoring this test, right?
You're mischaracterizing what
No.
I said.
I'm giving you a hypothetical, sir.
A hypothetical?
Yes.
Okay, if then that's a hypothetical, I would absolutely say that it probably would change the results somehow.
Well, why is it that in this hypothetical that I'm giving you, which is a lie, I made it up, and the other hypothetical that, or the other circumstance which the defendant gave you and then changed, what is so different about my hypothetical that would indicate to you that there would be a change and not a change to hers?
You indicated in your hypothetical that there were 20 people coming into
Sure.
the house. And the chaos involved in that and the disorganization would be greater than if there were 2 people involved. However, in both of her stories, someone was killed, her life was threatened, and she feared for her life. So those similarities made me feel that the redo of the test was not critical to my hypothesis of post-traumatic stress disorder, particularly because this was only a confirmation of my diagnosis.
And you're saying that in both instances, someone attempted to kill her, right? That's what you said, right?
Yes.
In the first one, when these 2 individuals came in, somebody put a gun to her head, that was an indication that somebody was going to kill her. And the second one, according to you, it was Mr. Alexander who, based on the story that she gave, that threatened to kill her, right?
Yes.
Both of those stories, sir, were told by the same person, right?
Yes.
So one of them has to be untrue, right?
Correct.
And so if one of those is untrue, doesn't that make that person suspect in terms of storytelling with regard to the PDS and anything else that is presented?
No.
So in other words, a person can make up a story and present that story to you, and you know it's not true, right?
Yes.
And based on that, if they then take a test anyway, like this PDS, and they give results on that test, according to you, for example, the answers to 16 to 21 that were asked about, well, I'm going to take these as truthful, 16 to 21, even though the answer to 14 may have been untrue. Right?
Based, I'm sorry, I don't know what your question is.
My question is that you are telling us that the answers to question 16 to 21, you believe are valid, right?
They were consistent for both scenarios.
Okay, I'm not asking if they were consistent with both scenarios. I'm asking whether or not you consider them valid.
The items themselves?
The answers to the items. The
Yes,
items
I do.
And the answers were valid to you, even though one of them, we don't know which one of them, or any of them, were based on an untruth, right?
That's right.
Isn't it true that the reason that you take that position is because you have compassion for the defendant?
No.
Isn't it true that you have changed or done things like exhibit number 550? And then exhibit number 535, isn't it true that you've done things like that because you have sympathy or are biased toward the defendant?
Absolutely not.
Isn't it true, sir, that it is an ethical issue for you to have, for example, Exhibit 535 represented as the only raw data, and then have Exhibit number 550 of the same person, same test, scored differently without you telling anybody any? Isn't that an ethical dilemma for you?
I recalculated the items because I had misplaced the sheet. And I wanted to recalculate so that I would have something to refer to, knowing that the first copy was sent in as part of my evaluation, but I didn't have access to it. So I recalculated it again so that I would have something to review when I was going through my reports. However, I might point out to you that either score met the criteria. It did not change the utility of the test.
But you're not answering my question. This does not run afoul of the psychiatric guidelines, what you just did in this case, where you have Exhibit 535, where you scored something, correct?
The original exhibit is the one that I submitted. The second one occurred because I did not have access to that, and I needed to have those numbers in front of me when I was doing my review.
I understand all of those justifications, but my question to you is, in terms of the ethical guidelines, Exhibit number 550 is the one that has the dots that are filled in, right?
Yes.
You filled those dots in, right?
Yes.
It wasn't the defendant that filled those dots in, right?
That's correct.
You're the person who scored this test, right?
Yes.
And you're also the person that scored number 535.
Yes.
Right? And do you remember, originally on cross-examination, that the prosecutor asked you for the raw data? Do you remember that?
Yes.
At that time, you didn't provide any of this raw data with the little circles on it, right?
No, I believe I did.
You think you did?
Objection, Judge, mischaracterizes what happened. May we approach?
You may.
Sir, in front of you, you have the original sheets that you indicate to us were used by Ms. Arias when she filled out the PDS, correct?
Well, I don't know if I have that because my notes have been picked apart and put into exhibit.
Well,
I don't know that I have those sheets.
Hold on, they're the yellow sheets with green tags in front of you. Do you have that in front of you?
Let's see. Ah, yes.
I didn't have that.
Yes.
Initially, during cross-examination, this is what you provided. Exhibit 534 is what you provided to the prosecutor, correct?
Right.
At that time, you indicated that you did not know where the scoring sheet was associated with this, correct?
Well, actually, it turns out that it was somewhere else in my book, but that's correct. I said that.
And you came back the next day, correct?
Yes.
And the next day is when you provided exhibit number 535, right?
Yes.
But at no time did you ever provide what's in exhibit 550, which is the scoring sheet with the little round circles on it, right?
Can I see that, please, sir?
Sure, of course.
Well, I have to have given it to you because we have copies here. So again, if you notice here, This is not an exhibit, but this is a copy that I brought with me. So I don't know where that confusion came
So-
from, but here it is.
So you now have a copy of Exhibit 550 in your file, correct?
Apparently, yes. This is a copy that I had, yes.
And with regard to Exhibit number 550, do you see that 550 has, it's 3-hole punched, right?
Yes,
Take a look at, let me go ahead and mark it, what you have there.
okay.
With regard to Exhibit 550, if you take a look at it, sir, this one does not have any holes punched in it, right?
That's correct, because those copies were made before I punched the holes.
Okay? I want you to look in your notebook to see if you have the one that corresponds to this one with the punched holes.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to take the weekend recess. So that you may plan accordingly, I am going to give you what we expect to be the schedule for the next 10 days or so. Next Thursday, this coming Thursday, a week from today. Is there anyone who could not be here at 9:30 in the morning? 9:30. All right, we're going to start at 9:30, and we will go till approximately 12:30. Then there will be no court in the afternoon on Thursday, no court on Friday, and no court on Monday, April 1st. You would then return on April 2nd at 10 a.m. So I'm telling you that so you may plan accordingly. With regard to this coming Monday, please be here at 10 a.m. Is there anyone who cannot be here at 10 a.m. on Monday? One additional matter I wanted to follow up, juror number 15, your hearing mechanism stopped working. Did you miss any testimony because of that, sir?
No, Your Honor, I heard it all.
Thank you. Any questions or other matters from the jury at this time? Let me follow up one more time. Have any of you seen or heard anything about this case in the media? Television, newspaper, radio, the internet? I see no hands. Has anyone attempted to influence you in any way outside this courtroom? I see no hands. Please remember the admonition. Have a nice weekend. You are excused. Please be seated. The record will show the jury has left the courtroom. Dr. Samuels, we'll see you back here at 10 o'clock on Monday. Do you have any other exhibits in your folders?
Well, these are my folder, but I'm still missing the exhibits that were just taken from me. So I would like to have that so that I can review them for the
All right. You can speak with Ms. Wilmot about that.
Okay.
All right. Is there anything else, counsel? All right. We are in recess.